Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 216 and I am the show's host Kyle. I got quite a bit of news to cover on today's show. I'm going to start off with some news on the organizations for the prohibition of chemical weapons, and then get into North Korea, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. So, again, just kind of cover what's been going on the past week. If you all haven't heard some of the recent episodes of the show, there's a few I would really suggest. One is a series on Russiagate that I did with Joanne Leon and Dan Wright of the Around the Empire podcast. You should definitely check out their show as well, Around the Empire. But those 3 episodes of Foreign Policy Focus, 211, 212, and 213 are absolutely excellent and really go through the whole Russiagate breakdown. And then the other one is the most previous episode of this show, episode 215. That was with Will Porter. We ran on Independence Day, talking about his recent article on veterans and how they're suffering from our wars overseas. For those of you who would like to share this show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. Alright, so starting off with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This organization is tasked with, helping to get rid of all the world's chemical weapons and then doing things like testing for chemical weapons, seeing what kind of chemical weapons are used. Trying to make sure countries respect treaties like they were tasked with making sure Assad gave over his chemical weapons to Russia in 2013. They've been tasked with investigating reports of chemical weapons in Syria as well as Salisbury, England. Now, previously, the OPCW came into existence at like a convention of the states. And this is like an international thing that happens. They vote this into existence. But I think the UN is really supposed to be kind of the monitoring, overseeing agency for the OPCW. Now, in the past, the OPCW has only been allowed to investigate and then give kind of the data behind it. So they're able to say, this happened, then this happened, and then this happened. But they're not able to say, for example, Putin used chemical weapons, Israel used chemical weapons, the UK used chemical weapons. All they could really say is that chemical weapons were used of this type on this date and in this location. I'm sure they could give the method it, dropped from or whatever else they were actually able to, have evidence for and just present the evidence. However, now the OPCW can prescribe blame, and this is a power they voted themselves. Now, it seems that there's quite a few people who are upset by this, thinking it's more or less an end around of the UN Security Council where Russia could have vetoed it as a permanent member state. I'm not quite sure, what the international law legality is here, because it's one of those things where, this is an international organization and, they could kind of just do what they want and nobody's going to go invade the Hague and the OPCW headquarters there. So my guess is that, there's not a whole lot anybody who opposed this resolution can do with it. Now, it does seem that for the OPCW to really go out and do anything, for example, like investigate in Syria a chemical weapons attack, there has to be some kind of UN resolution for that. And the OPCW inspectors travel with UN security teams and have UN license plates and identifications. But there's a lot of concern that I now have that, this is really going to politicize the OPCW even more so than before. And let's say the OPCW starts to have a, United States leading, an Israeli leading, hell, a Russian leading, or an Assad leading political bent, then you can no longer, trust kind of the results they give you. And we've seen in the past, and, me and Will Porter have talked in the past about problems in OPCW report. I think the most notable example was including the fact that the Khan Sheikhoun chemical weapons attack victims began showing up at the hospital before the attack, only in the footnotes and not within the, kind of actual conclusions themselves. So we'll see what happens here. This, one of the unfortunate effects may be that, anytime the OPCW is, proposed to go in and investigate a chemical weapons attack, that resolution will just be vetoed at the UN, because nobody's going to trust their results or findings anymore. I want to talk about some North Korea stuff. The first thing is, the US, finally opened their new base in South Korea. This has come along with some problems. I think some of them are environmental. And I'm going to try to hopefully get some follow-up reports here after the base is the old base is closed and, see how this plays out. But this could be some real issue because they use pretty nasty chemicals, for some of these military facilities. Now, this does mean, I think, for the first time, there's not like U.S. military personnel stationed in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Now, I don't want to go too far and celebrate this because, they just moved the base somewhere else, but I think it's kind of, a thing that people are now able to say, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The bad news, I guess, is that opening a new military base, now there's kind of that financial and bureaucracy incentive to keep it open, because I'm sure there's a lot of contracts that go into the new base. I'm sure the new base has all kind of amenities. And also, if you're a congressperson who went and voted for, the funding for this base, then your opponent is going to say next time, well, Congressman so-and-so voted for a, $3 billion military base in South Korea that was closed 3 weeks later. That's not going to look very good for you. So none of these reasons to keep the base are good enough, or should keep the base there by any logical standards. But from the standards of our congressmen, I would not be surprised if this is something that forces or keeps that base open longer than it needs to. All right, let's get to some good news real quick, and that is that North and South Korea played like a friendly basketball game. Kim Jong-un himself was not in attendance, but the North Korean sports commissioner or whoever was. This goes back to something that I think Ron Paul makes the point the best and has been advocating for it forever, really. And that is that, people should play sports and shouldn't hate each other and shouldn't fight over things. And it's, the smartest thing to do is to have countries playing sports against each other. And we saw this with the Winter Olympics. That was a positive moment. This wasn't quite a Rocky V moment or anything like that, but the more friendly competition you can have, the more exposure you can have of South Koreans to North Koreans and vice versa. It's going to be a positive. Those relationships will be formed, and there will be more and more interest in easing the tensions between the two countries. Because at the end of the day, if you could begin relationships on the other sides of the border, if you could start trade, then there's just less and less incentive to keep the fighting going. Now, bad news, John Bolton has went on the Sunday morning shows and said that he has a plan for North Korea to denuclearize within 1 year. This sounds completely stupid to me and probably will not work. Now, maybe the North Koreans have agreed to something here that's absolutely drastic and unbelievable, and that wouldn't be a bad thing. And, John Bolton knows about it, is just trying to look smart and take advantage and claim credit for it. But I think more likely this is another Bolton attempt to spoil the deal. We know that John Bolton believes the U.S. has a right to launch a preemptive war against North Korea because of their previous threats to the, Americans and testing of ballistic and then nuclear weapons. Even though, North Korea really doesn't present an offensive threat to the Americans, and his boss, Donald Trump, now has said that North Korea no longer presents a threat to us and we're no longer at war with them. I've talked about this a lot on the show, and I'll link to one of the previous episodes where I talk about the Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump summit and kind of explain how the process of denuclearization here is probably going to be pretty long. Because you're not going to have a lot of trust on either side. You have Trump's National Security Advisor John Bolton previously saying on Fox News that, when North Koreans are talking, they're lying. And so obviously the Trump administration doesn't have great trust for the North Koreans. And I think you could understand why the North Koreans wouldn't have a whole lot of trust for the Americans. As, again, John Bolton was part of, Dick Cheney and a few others under George Bush that lied about North Korea's nuclear ambitions and nuclear weapons programs back then and bullied the North Koreans out of the agreed framework, which had been negotiated under the Clinton administration. And so there's reasons on both sides for distrust. If you'll remember back, I've talked about this on the show as well, that during the actual Korean War, I think between like 20 and 25% of North Koreans were potentially killed by that war. And so, again, if there's a popular distrust among North Koreans for Americans, well, this is something that, makes a little bit of sense. And so, it may take time. It may take North Korea giving up 10 nuclear weapons and the Americans moving X number of troops out of South Korea. And then North Korea giving up another 5 and the Americans moving maybe the B-1B bombers out of Guam. And moves like this will help to ease tensions and build trust between the two countries that, when you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it. Now, I think the good news here is that Mike Pompeo is on his way to North Korea, I believe right now as I'm recording this, but we'll be there on Friday and part of Saturday in Pyongyang for talks. Mike Pompeo, as much as I railed against him getting the nomination and confirmed to be Secretary of State, and he hasn't been good on many issues, but he has been dedicated to this Korean peace process and has been one of the pieces that's helped to make it happen. And I'm not saying that John Bolton, or Mike Pompeo, has done anything extraordinary to make that happen. Just, he hasn't gotten in the way and messed it up, which I'm sure he really could have with the position he's been in here. So hopefully Bolton can, tell them that this is Donald Trump's plan, and John Bolton, some old crank with a mustache who's only in that position because Donald Trump wanted Sheldon Adelson's money, dealing with the Israeli issue and not the North Korean issue at all. And maybe this could ease some of North Korea's concerns that I'm sure they're having right now. Last thing I'll mention, this happened over a week ago, I think, and I just haven't had a chance to talk about it on the show, but that is North and South Korea held military talks, and North Korea is looking to move back some of their long-range artillery. This is something I've long talked about again on the show. Is just that North Korea has this long-range artillery that, is within range of Seoul, and that means about 30 million people, including 100,000 Americans and lots of other American military personnel, and is a real problem if, war would ever break out between North and South Korea. This would be the shelling of a major city, and I'm sure absolute destruction and, tens, hundreds, millions of deaths potentially. The last thing I'll mention here is that on Mike Pompeo's path, after North Korea, he's stopping in Japan, and Japan is looking to buy advanced radar systems from the United States. And, this is going to be Mike Pompeo acting as a Lockheed Martin sales representative and making that company a whole bunch of money, while again, always the American taxpayers are footing the bill and getting nothing from it. Syria. There's two places in Syria I want to talk about. First is the Kurds. This is a little bit more big picture. Of course, the Syrian Kurds, or the YPG, have been backed by the United States. The Department of Defense through most of the whole war, but has been the main side backed by the United States since like 2014 or so, when the ISIS caliphate got really big and the US CIA backed rebels were becoming a problem. So then the Department of Defense backed rebels, helped to defeat the ISIS guy. Now, by doing this, and with the US backing, they have gained a huge amount of territory. Syrian Kurdistan really only existed in North Syria and northeastern Syria along the Turkish border, but they've since been able to take Kirkuk and really all of Syria that's east of the Euphrates River, minus the territory that the U.S. allows to be controlled by ISIS. Now, in North Syria, you have seen some losses for the Kurds recently. They lost Afrin, which is an enclave they held along the Turkish border north of Aleppo. The Turks came in and took that, and then they also held the city of Manbij that was west of the Euphrates River. Turkey has long protested the Kurds holding that, and the United States finally negotiated them out of the city. It seems that it's about time for some of the Kurdish groups at least to start cutting deals with the Assad administration here. And what I'm reading is that, like most of these groups, the Kurds here are not a cohesive whole, and there's people with different interests. And I think the Kurds, especially along the Turkish border, are afraid that they could be attacked by Turkey and wouldn't receive support from the United States. And so the person I think best in position to protect them is going to be Assad. And so they may start looking to cut deals and coming back under Assad. Now, Assad keeps saying that, his goal is to control all of Syria again. And he's kind of finishing up the Syrian rebels now in southwestern Syria. This is along the Israeli-Jordan-Lebanon border area that's shared with Syria. A lot of the rebels there are either Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The main city there is Dara, and that's actually where the Syrian Civil War resistance started back in 2011, I believe. And so that, this plays some significance there. It seems so far to be unfolding pretty much like the liberation, or, depending on how you look at it, the conquering of most other cities and territories held by rebels. Assad's coming in, isolating them, waging a bombing campaign, offering anybody who's willing to give up their weapons and leave to go to the northern areas of Syria in the Idlib province, and allowing civilians to leave too if they want to. He's also, opening up and sometimes has these amnesty windows. I'm assuming that he's somewhat following through on them because people continue to take the amnesty and, just, give up and go on the other side of this war. But, there are some that hold out, and Russia and Syria are waging a brutal bombing campaign that's hitting civilian shelters and hospitals, and this continues to remain a problem for the civilians of Syria as well. Now, interesting to know about these rebels is a lot of them were supported by Israel, actually, including the al-Nusra or al-Qaeda fighters, and so it does seem that some of the support coming to them from Israel, which at times has actually been intervening in the Syrian Civil War and either bombing or shelling Assad-backed forces positions, they do seem to be letting the rebels now lose and surrender. All right, so I want to talk about some great journalism right now, surprisingly here, about Yemen. PBS NewsHour journalist Jane Ferguson travels to Yemen here. And it seems to me that she was probably legally able to get into southern Yemen in Aden and then smuggled herself into northern Yemen where, pretty much as of this point, Western journalists have not been allowed in. Other than Alex Potter, who's been doing some very good journalism and reporting for The Intercept recently, and Iona Craig, you don't read about too many journalists who actually make it into the rebel-held territory of Yemen in the capital city of Sana'a. And this is more from, a blockaded journalist by the Saudi coalition, rather than, the Houthis preventing them from entry, being afraid that maybe their war crimes or whatever would be exposed. The best example of this, of course, is the 60 Minutes crew that attempted to board a humanitarian aid flight and enter Yemen by Sana'a airport, and they were blocked by the Saudi coalition from doing so. As of the actual reporting itself, it's not bad. I think she does a fairly good job of covering Yemen. I'm going to start off with the thing I think she gets wrong most first, and that is the Houthi supporting, or Iran supporting the Houthis. She kind of, even breaks it down and says that, the set of Islam practiced by the Zaydis, which are the main ethnic group that makes up the Houthis in Yemen, is related to Shia Islam and isn't even really Shia Islam, and not the way the Iranians practice it. It wouldn't be considered Shia Islam. And then actually at the end of the first interview, she even explains that it's more of a political alliance and that it's just accusations from the Saudi government and the U.S. government that it's more of a actual weapons-based alliance and that weapons are entering Yemen from Iran. However, unfortunately, through most of the journalism, she just says Iranian backed. So, related to this, I also think she gets wrong the motivation for the war, pinning it all to the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, we know from reporting from the New York Times and quotes from U.S. Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power at the time, she explains that the U.S. entered to placate Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia was concerned about the U.S. moving closer to Iran post-nuclear deal, which, of course, the super dark humor there is that it turns out this war actually lives the peace agreement that this war is being fought to, preserve. But also we know that Saudi Arabia likely entered this war because now Crown Prince, but then Defense Minister in his late 20s, decides that he needs a real victory. And so he calls this Operation Decisive Storm, thinking that he's going to go kit these poor Houthis. And I mean poor as in, like the people of Yemen. Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East. So he thinks he's going to go pick on the poor people and put whoever he wants in charge. And it just hasn't worked out very well for him since. Now, what her reporting, I think, does a very good job of showing is the devastation from the air war. I was disappointed that she didn't mention the bombing of the funeral hall, even though she showed footage actually of that attack. But she documents the Saudi coalition bombing bridges, roads, hospitals, funerals, weddings, and the cholera treatment facility. So there was some very powerful footage there, especially when it comes to the humanitarian crisis and seeing what they say are 11-year-old children, which you wouldn't ever think that they're 11 years old by looking for them, with just these unbelievable situations, and that they're starving to death every day, and the whole experience of life must be just enormously painful for these poor children. And knowing, I'm sure this is going to do long-term health damage to these kids who, at the fundamental points of life are not getting enough food and are literally starving to death. And another thing I think she points out well is she goes out with some Houthis and they point her and they say, look, this is a U.S.-made bomb. This is a U.S.-made cluster bomb. This is a U.S.-made guided munition. And they're able to show her that really this is a U.S. war. She interviews a scholar in Sana'a. And that university professor explains that, it may be the Saudis flying the plane, but it's a U.S. made plane. It's a U.S. made bomb. The U.S. is refueling it. This U.S. is helping to enforce the blockade. And so, really this is a U.S.-led war. And I think this particular, kind of journalism here is very powerful, high quality video. And, hats off to Jane Ferguson for going in, which I'm sure is a very dangerous operation here, crossing between the lines, knowing how indiscriminately Saudi bombs Yemen, and yet going there and, trying to expose this absolute devastation to an entire population. Got some news that Saudi Arabia bombed another Yemeni wedding, this time killing 11 people. And the UAE has halted their offensive of Hodeidah City. They say this is, of course, for humanitarian reasons. However, it's probably just because the offensive doesn't seem to be going particularly well. And while I continue to read from Western sources that the Hodeidah airport had fallen to the UAE bad forces, it seems that the Houthis actually still control that airport. Afghanistan, the ceasefire has ended. The government imposed side of the ceasefire, and the U.S. immediately carried out about 20 airstrikes on Taliban targets. I mainly want to talk about Yemen or Afghanistan to refer you all to a Scott Horton show interview with Kathy Kelly. I'll link to it in the show notes page, but basically she just goes over how dire the situation is for the people of Afghanistan and, the terror that people live in, particularly in the capital city, Kabul. I just want to update, because the last time I talked about this story, the Iraqi court had issued a full recount of the election. Now they've changed it to just a recount of any suspect ballots. I don't know what this means and how it's going to change the results of the election. It seems that a body has made a deal with the person who took the most parliamentary seats during the election, and that is Muqtada al-Sadr. And so we'll see if they can form a coalition government and appoint some kind of prime minister. This is something that I went into a lot of detail with on my episode with Scott Horton. That's Foreign Policy Focus number 200. All right, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. I hope you all are enjoying it, and let me know what you think. Twitter, I'm on at KYAAALE. Facebook, my page is Kyle's Files. You also check out the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. And then I'm a part of the podcaster network, Libertarian Union. And there's a lot of guys in there who do great work. You could check out the page for the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, and libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find all my work, including my daily news roundup. And my news website is immersionnews.com. And if you really want to help me out and support the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Thanks, everyone.